Professor Jack Chin is at the UC Davis School of Law, and our topic today is the question of immigration. We know that it is the top of the list for voters all around the country, and we know that for sure. What we don't know is kind of how we got to where we are in this broken immigration system we have right now. And what is also hard to figure out is what actually does a good immigration system look like? If this system is broken, what's a good one? So we're incredibly fortunate and honored to have Professor Chin with us here because he has spent his academic career, or at least a good portion of it, writing, teaching, speaking, and publishing on this very topic of immigration. He also works on a variety of other areas, but he's well known in his field. He regularly appears on lists of the most cited legal scholars. And one of the programs he runs at UC Davis, which I thought was just wonderful, is an advocacy program working with students, doing things like persuading the Ohio legislature to ratify the 14th Amendment, because who knew that they hadn't, or persuading several states to repeal anti-Asian alien land laws, or getting the California Supreme Court to posthumously admit an attorney to the bar who had been banned because of his race back in 1890. So you can see he has a lot of credits on his list. And again, we're very honored to have you here, Professor Chin. And I will turn it over to you and stop sharing my screen and let you share yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Great. Well, thank you. It's wonderful to have this opportunity to speak with all of you. I will try and deal with a very large and significant subject quickly. This is an important slide. This shows the number of migrants who have come to the United States as permanent immigrants, not as tourists or as temporary business visitors, from 1820 to 2022. And you can see that it's been big numbers over the years, starting small in 1820 when the United States was a lot smaller. In the 1880s to the 1920s, much larger. Then a huge drop-off, thanks to a law 100 years ago, the Immigration Act of 1924, which I'll talk about more. But that didn't last, and after World War II, a steady, unbroken increase to numbers that in some years exceeded the historical peaks of over 100 years ago, but in a much larger country matching them, just under or just over 1 million a year. The history of immigration policy, immigration regulation, is that at the founding, to some extent, there was none. Open borders in a way. The Supreme Court said in 1852, this country is open to all men who wish to come to it. No question or demand of a passport meets them at the border. There were no passports, no visas, no exclusions based on criminal grounds or race. Anybody who wanted to come here could come here, no numerical limitations, with some exceptions. And here's a statute from 1803 which illustrates the major exception. And the major exceptions were based on race and poverty. So there were no federal restrictions in 1852 when the Supreme Court wrote, and arguably up until 1882. But there were state restrictions. States excluded the poor. And if a poor person tried to move to a state or a town, they had some susceptibility to getting excluded or even deported. And based on race, the United States, this is a federal statute passed in 1803 based on the Haitian Revolution. And the Congress said, if the states want to keep out free blacks, then we're going to help them do that using the Coast Guard and the Navy and the Customs Service, because we want to support that state policy. The other major exception was regulation of the slave trade, which the prohibition of the slave trade, which in part was a humanitarian policy, a human rights policy, and in part was a demographic policy designed to keep persons of African ancestry out of the United States. The other major piece of federal regulation of immigration was naturalization. Starting in 1790 and continuing until 1952, there were racial restrictions on naturalization. Free white persons were the people eligible. And this was a restriction on who could become a citizen, but it was also intended to be and functioned as a limitation on naturalization, because there were lots of, in addition to political restrictions on non-citizens, there were economic restrictions. Non-citizens couldn't own land, and so Congress understood that state law would mean that somebody who couldn't become a citizen through naturalization was likely not to want to come here at all. So the policy was to encourage white immigration, and we see that in opinions of the Supreme Court, where one justice says, who's in the majority, "We have invited to come to our country from other lands all free white persons of every grade and of every religious belief in order to build up the nation." Other justices said, no, we really only want Christian foreigners of our own race. But non-Christian white people weren't excluded or anything like that. Chief Justice Taney, the villain of the Dred Scott case, which denied that persons of African ancestry had any rights under US law, also said the same thing about Asian immigrants. This was a case that he decided when he was sitting in a trial court, and he said, look, this country was founded by white people from the Christian nations of Europe, and that's who they wanted to come here. And it wasn't just that non-whites were disadvantaged. White immigrants were advantaged in a number of ways historically under immigration policy. Many states, for example, allowed non-whites who were, whites who were non-citizens to vote if they had taken the formal step of beginning the naturalization process by declaring their intention to become citizens, which was a court filing. States and the federal government in the territories allowed declarants to vote. This is a federal statute that offers another benefit to white people. There was a policy, as I'm sure you know, of taking the land away from the Indians and giving it to white people. And it was available. This is the Donation Land Act of 1850, which covered the Oregon Territory, a huge area. It's not just Oregon, it's Oregon, Washington, Idaho. And eligible for the free land were white settlers, American half-breed Indians included, and non-citizens who had declared their intent to become a citizen. So there's this significant encouragement of white immigration. Even when there was no direct restriction with a few limitations. Here's the policy that developed after the open borders era. In 1882, we have the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it's coupled with a general immigration regulation for the first time. They take over the kinds of things that states would exclude people for, and make it a federal exclusion. Persons likely to become a public charge. We don't want people who aren't going to be able to support themselves, people afflicted with a loathsome disease, anarchists. But as of 1882, there are these restrictions on certain people, but there's no numerical limitation. Still, as many people who want to come can come. In 1917, Chinese exclusion is transformed to Asian exclusion. A geographical area on continental Asia is prohibited from immigration. With regard to immigrants who are allowed to come, until 1917, there was immigration enforcement at the border. But if you made it in, then there was much less legal chance that you would be deported for something that happened afterwards, let's say, if you committed a crime. Even if you weren't allowed to come in when you came in, there was a statute of limitations that said, you know, if you're here, you're here. But in 1917, there was a general deportation policy that was added, that there's people who might have been here for a long time, people who might have come in here legally, but we're not crazy about them now, and so the law is going to kick them out. 100 years ago, in the Immigration Act of 1924, we had the national origins quota system, which was the first permanent numerical limitation. It perfected Asian exclusion by deeming those ineligible to naturalize, also ineligible to immigrate. And it gave each country in the world a quota, with the exception of Africa, the continent of Africa excluded, but it gave all the other countries in the world a quota based on the number of Americans who were already in the United States at the time. But the time was 1890. The goal of the 1924 Act was to maintain the demographics of the United States as of 1890. So countries with Jewish and Catholic populations got low quotas compared to their population, because that was the period when their population in the United States was growing. I want to suggest to you that the anti-Asian policy was one of the three great race policies of the United States, the other two being subordination of African Americans and the dispossession of Native Americans. Those were basically completely successful, and so too was Asian exclusion. In 1960, about 1/2% of the US population was Asian. The population of the world is 50% Asian. In 1965, we have the big turning point. In my opinion, the Immigration Act of 1965 is part of the Civil Rights Movement. It should be understood as a sibling of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. They got rid of the national origins quota system. They created the current system. In 1965, there were 290,000 green cards available each year. That is to say, 290,000 offers of permanent residency, as opposed to a tourist visa or a business visa. 290,000 a year. They created the first refugee admissions policy. And I also believe that the 1965 Immigration Act was the most successful of the great civil rights laws of the Second Reconstruction. Before 1965, 85% of the immigrant stream was white people from Europe. After 1965, on a race-neutral basis, on a demand basis, it was reversed. About 85% of the immigration, 85% of the immigration is from the third world. Not affirmative action, but based on demand and qualifications. That's how it worked out. Another major moment that I want to tell you about is 1990. The demand for immigration is significant. 1990 is a different era than we're in now, obviously. And the number of visas that was made available was permanently increased to 675,000, a minimum of 675,000. So there's a decision that's been made that we're going to have substantial immigration in 1965, and it's reaffirmed in 1990. So how does it work? There's different categories of who gets to come in. Family-sponsored immigration, there's no limit to the number of spouses and unmarried children under 21 of US citizens. If there's a spouse of a US citizen, even if they were naturalized yesterday, and there's a child of a US citizen, they can fill out the paperwork and come to the United States, or stay in the United States. However, they're still subject to all of the qualifications, not all, but many or most of the qualifications and exclusions that any immigrant is subject to. So a spouse of a US citizen who is not themselves a citizen, who has a criminal conviction, or who's previously been deported, is not going to be able to come to the United States, probably. A small category of immigration comes from the diversity lottery. And the diversity lottery is a lottery that was designed to help countries. It's affirmative action. It was designed to be affirmative action for whites to give some visas to countries that had low immigration demand and were adversely affected by the 1965 Immigration Act. 50,000 a year, 10, 15 million people enter the lottery each year. The only people who are allowed to enter are people from low immigration countries. And Africa is often the major source of immigration under the diversity lottery. That is, so many people from Africa apply and get picked and qualify, that's often the greatest source of the 50,000 who ultimately win the lottery every year. The main larger sources are quota-limited family-sponsored visas and quota-limited employment-based visas. And I won't go into the details, but I will say there are categories that go from the most deserving, according to Congress, to less deserving. And there are qualifications for employment-based visas and family relationships for family-sponsored visas. And if you don't fit into one of the categories, you can't immigrate. For example, if you're the sibling of a lawful permanent resident, which is somebody who's in the United States, they've won the green card lottery somehow, there's no path to immigration. Because the lowest category is siblings of citizens. And same with employment-based visas. If you don't have if you don't fit into one of the pigeonholes, there's no path to immigration under these categories. So we don't have we don't allocate visas by country anymore. We don't say we're going to give 100 a year to Italy and 500,000 a year to Ireland. But there is a 7% limitation per country in the law. So Monaco gets the same number of visas as India, as Mexico. And these 4 countries, China, India, Mexico, and the Philippines, are both large and for various reasons have high immigration demand. And so this is a chart from something called the Visa Bulletin that talks about waiting lists. And what I want you to see here is there's waiting lists for everybody. So even if you're entitled to a visa and you're approved for a visa, you have to wait for one to become available. And for the 480,000 or 195,000 a year to be dealt out for that year. And when they're dealt out in 2024, they're being given to people who have applied way back in the past. And if you look at F1, unmarried sons and daughters of citizens, that is over 21, for most people, we're talking about 9 years ago. F1, the current date is 8 July 2015. But for Mexico, it's 22 years ago. So it really depends on your country of origin. Employment-based visas, the same. For the first priority, which is the most skilled and desirable workers, for a lot of them, they're current. But for other workers, depending on the category and the country, there might be a years-long wait. Refugee, Wendy, how are we doing on time? Say again?
10 more minutes?
Okay. The other major way that people get to the United States permanently, in addition to diversity, family-sponsored, employment-based, is through the refugee program. And the refugee program helps people who are persecuted or have a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. This is sort of a post-World War II development for obvious historical reasons. It does not operate to help people who are starving, who are in a war zone, who are living under environmental conditions that are unsurvivable. It's about discriminatory persecution. And if your problem is famine or drought, yeah, you're not being discriminated against. So this program doesn't help you, and we don't have programs directly for that, at least not that have a path to citizenship. And refugee status does have a path to citizenship. Lawful permanent resident status does have a path to citizenship. And that's one of the reasons they're important. So the refugee definition is used in two contexts. It's used for the refugee program, which is an overseas organized program where our government brings individuals or groups over based on evaluation of the world situation. The number is set by the president annually, and President Biden has been good about it. 125,000 since 2022. President Trump, 10,000, 15,000, much smaller numbers. Asylum is a program, a legal status that somebody in the United States claims to be a refugee, claims to meet this definition, either because they're being deported and they don't want to be deported, or because they've come to the United States in some other category as a tourist, as a student, and they don't want to go back. And so they're so-called defensive claims and affirmative claims to asylum status by individuals in the United States who claim to be refugees. There's no limit on the number of those. Here's a snapshot of the refugee program. Overseas situations where the United States reaches out, takes people, brings them back to the United States. And the big countries in the last 10 years, Burma, Congo, Iraq, Somalia, Bhutan, Syria, Ukraine, etc. And we're looking at tens of, the top 10, 15 have tens of thousands of refugee entries. This is a snapshot of the asylum program. Also, 10, 20,000 a year. It depends on the world political situation. So they're relatively small numbers, but not insignificant. in recent years. Who gets asylum? People from China, Venezuela, El Salvador, Guatemala, other countries. So that's who gets here. I want to say a few words about what the issues are in current immigration policy. President Trump, I think it's fair to say, was anti-immigration. He slow-walked the regular immigration process. He used the authority of the government to restrict processing of visas. So the number, notwithstanding the authorized number of lawful permanent resident admissions every year, it went down. Part of that was because of the pandemic, but part of that was policy. He had very low, he authorized, as he was entitled to do under the law, very few refugee admissions, opposed to refugee admissions. So what will happen in another Trump term, should there be one? He has promised mass deportation camps. And who knows if he's just, if this is an empty promise or not. He has said over the years that he wants to cut the number of lawful permanent residents. He wants to reduce the number of green cards that are available every year. He made the processing of applicants for asylum at the southern border much more difficult. That was part of the family separation program. That was part of the Remain in Mexico program. He, as Democratic presidents have also done, but also Republican presidents, wants to streamline the process of making judgments that somebody is really an economic refugee or an environmental refugee, and therefore they're not a refugee under the legal definition, and so they should go back. And so there'll be many more people who are summarily denied asylum and not given a chance to prove their case in an additional Trump term. Another thing that he has fought for, that supported, is a perennial conservative wish, which is to deny birthright citizenship to the children of undocumented people and perhaps other immigrants. Under the Constitution, according to the Supreme Court, everyone born in the United States, except the children of diplomats and soldiers in hostile occupation, if you're born here, you're a citizen. So children of undocumented people are U.S. citizens. I will give you an op-ed that I wrote with two other law professors who, like me, are grandchildren of undocumented migrants. The Supreme Court has said that children of undocumented migrants are themselves U.S. citizens. This is a bloody shirt that gets waved every 5 or 10 years by the right wing. So those are the issues. Those are issues that are going to come up. Other issues. People on the left are often critical of our deportation policy. It's easy to get deported now based on a criminal conviction, even a relatively minor criminal conviction. In the past, when the immigrant stream was white, there was a lot more leniency, and it was a lot more difficult to get deported. And a lot of the methods of relief that Congress created were racially restricted. You could only get the benefit if you were white. And so deportation of persons convicted of crimes, breaking up families, is a perennial policy question. The empirical background is this. On the one hand, immigrants commit a lot less crime than other people. Immigrants, documented and undocumented, commit less crime than people who have legal status in the United States or who are U.S. citizens. But part of that might be, one, the fear of getting deported by a harsh policy, and the fact that a lot of migrants who do commit crimes are deported and therefore can't commit crimes in the United States. And so, politically, policy-wise, that's a tough problem. Another tough problem. What is the appropriate division between these two numbers? Should we, as a country, even if we're committed to humanitarian admissions, for things other than humanitarian admissions, should we prioritize skilled immigration and nuclear family reunification? Or, as we have done, we prioritize extended family reunification, siblings, adult married children. And as a matter of policy and as a matter of politics, it has been observed that if instead of siblings of citizens, we brought in more engineers, immigration might be more popular and the economy might be better off. The last issue to think about is the asylum policy, and I don't think that there are very few people who would argue for something other than a robust asylum policy. But at the moment, even immigration scholars that I know on the left and immigration advocates are concerned about the appearance of anarchy on the southern border when people who simply by making a claim for asylum have some chance of getting into the United States and not necessarily being after that in the process of having their claim decided, in which case they get to stay, or if they're approved, or it's rejected, and then they're deported. Some of them become part of the large number of undocumented people in the United States. And are we going to be able to have a more robust legal immigration policy and legalization policy if the appearance of control on the southern border is obtained? What is the trade-off there? Okay, I'll stop, and I'd be happy to answer questions if there's time.
Yes, there's time. And thank you very much. For people who want to ask questions, you can put it in the chat and I'll read it out to everybody, or you can raise your hand, whichever you prefer.
There's one in the chat now.
Why don't you read it, Larry?
Can Professor Chin please describe the extent of current illegal immigration to the U.S. and how many undocumented annually? What's the process for undocumented immigrants currently?
Well, sort of definitionally, we don't know exactly how many undocumented people there are in the United States. But the estimates are 10 to 15 million, with most of them being, a plurality from Mexico, Central and South America, a lot from Asia. With 10 or 15 million undocumented people, the authorities, the immigration authorities, the federal immigration authorities, which are the largest federal law enforcement agency now, if you take into account Customs and Border Protection and Homeland Security that does immigration. Those are the largest agencies. immigration crimes are usually the largest number of crimes that are prosecuted in federal court every year. But the budget permits deportation of 400,000 people a year, is what the feds tell us under Republican and Democratic presidents. 400,000 people a year, 10 or 15 million here. So there has to be prioritization. And the prioritization tends to be one so-called border enforcement, border control, and that is to say people crossing the border now. They want to stop people from getting equity in the country. And so illegal border crossers are a priority to catch them and send them back as quickly as possible. The other major priority are so-called criminal aliens, non-citizens, either documented or undocumented, because lawful permanent residents, green card holders, can be deported from the United States if they haven't naturalized, who've committed crimes. And the administrations all say we're looking for, Democratic and Republican, we're looking for serious offenders. We're looking for people causing harm to the community. But in many instances, they're relatively minor crimes. And in many instances, using a legal category called aggravated felony, which doesn't have to be aggravated, and it doesn't even have to be a felony. There are misdemeanors that meet the definition of aggravated felony. And if somebody is convicted of an aggravated felony and they're not a US citizen, they're deported under an expedited procedure. So we have all of these millions of people. We have 400,000 deportations a year. More or less, the border control and criminal alien numbers fill those up. So there are lots of people who are never going to be on the list to get deported, even though they don't have legal status in the United States, unless they're terribly unlucky. Now, I will say, historically, what's been done with this is amnesty. And over the years, there have been amnesty after amnesty. There was about 6 times there was this thing called registry, which is still on the books, and registry basically says anybody who can prove that they've been here since before a certain date, we're going to assume that you're here legally. And if there's some other reason to deport you, maybe you'll be deported, but you won't be deported simply because you don't have some sort of legal status. And registry was started in the teens or the 20s, and it was updated 5 or 6 times. And the last time it was updated was maybe in the 80s. But the registry date now, there's still a registry date, is 1972. So you have to, in order to get the benefit of that one, you have to have been here since before 1972. And so amnesty has, and maybe I shouldn't use that word because that's a bad word politically, but that's what it was. And historically, that's been the policy. And ultimately, some sort of regularization is going to have to happen.
Okay, we have Tama has her hand up. Go ahead, Tama.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you, Dr. Chen, for your presentation today. I know a lot of it had to do with history and policy, and I'm wondering if you have any advice to us to use on messaging. As you know, this is one of the main issues for the upcoming election, and a lot of it is so derogatory and negative and fear-based. What do you tell your students or just people like us in general on how to have positive conversations and not further the fear, approach it from a more humanitarian or humanity viewpoint that we can use in conversations with people?
I mean, at one level, my answer is I don't know. Immigration has been, in my view, an essentially unmitigated economic good for the country. it has, as I said, and the studies from every source say this, immigrants, documented and undocumented, commit less crime in the United States. They're here to work. They're here, they keep their heads down. And on the other hand, what the immigration policy has been about, and this is sort of why I went through it, is resentment of other people coming in and getting opportunities. And it has, the immigration restriction, immigration policy has been a way for xenophobic people, racist people, to punish other folks that they don't like. We can't kick citizens out of the country. But it's possible for immigration policy to impose suffering on people who do not have legal protection. In terms of where we go from here, I do think, though, that there is a trade-off. And I'm looking at this from an academic perspective. I'm looking at this from a scholarly perspective. I think we should have, the number of immigrants that we should have, I think, is much larger. We should have a much larger immigration stream. But I recognize that there is a trade-off in the sense that if we have more immigrants, then it's going to affect social policy. It's going to affect social welfare policy. If we mitigate the exclusion which still exists of people likely to become a public charge, and we allow more people in who are not economically well equipped, what does that mean for social welfare policy? Right now, undocumented immigrants and many lawful permanent residents are not allowed to get federally funded social welfare programs. But we don't want people starving in the streets. And at least I do want a robust safety net. And so how do you balance those things? It's not simple. The other thing I want to say, though, is, yeah, the immigration system is broken in a way. It like a lot of other systems, it creates countless individual injustices of people who should be allowed to come, according to me, but aren't allowed to come, or shouldn't be kicked out, according to me, but are kicked out. But we also have high hundreds of thousands or millions of people a year who come here and they, as lawful permanent residents, and they have rights, and they're on a path to citizenship, and many of them become citizens, and their children are US citizens, and they don't get deported because they're not unlucky and they're not convicted of a crime. So compared to the other system that I study, the criminal legal system, the immigration system lumbers along. It achieves a lot of good. It functions in certain ways that it has the right outcome, I believe, in more cases than the criminal justice system does. And so I think it's a institution that's desperately in need of repair, but I kind of like it at the same time. And the political thing, I guess that was what I was getting at with the division between family-sponsored and employment-based immigration. And there is an argument to be made that the right, some on the right, regardless of their cultural views, support economic development. And so if we had 480,000 employment-based visas a year and 195,000 family-sponsored, immigration might be more popular because we would be getting more engineers and doctors and protecting the nuclear family, but not the so-called chain migration where someone comes here and as they, you come here as a student, you get a green card, you naturalize, you bring your parents over, you bring your siblings over, they naturalize. Why that group of people as opposed to some doctors and engineers? And the answer, there certainly are answers, right? And the answer might be, we believe in the family. And people who have US citizen relatives over here already, they're more likely to assimilate. But so there are reasons that it makes sense, and there are reasons that other people who aren't necessarily racist would want a different system. And then, of course, there are people who use various arguments about immigration reform as covers for racism, because, as I say, one of the key characteristics, if we get more doctors and engineers, they're probably going to be coming from the third world, because we're not going to get a huge number of Swiss and French doctors and engineers.
All right. So we have time for one more question, and I know there's more than one question out there, but just to sort of dovetail on what you were just talking about, Jody has asked whether there are immigration reform ideas that people on the left and the right agree on, and is that a way, or there are ideas in common? Is there a way forward trying to focus on those ideas?
Other than focusing on the economic benefits of high-skill immigration, I think to some extent the answer is no. We've been working on, as a society, have been working on immigration reform, since George W. Bush, and maybe before, and the politics is so difficult because the labor unions play a role here, big business, the left and the right. There are economic interests and cultural interests, and we probably had, for example, a moment within the last 20 years where there could have been a DREAM Act just for the Dreamers, but it would have meant selling out the other undocumented people, or it would have meant carving them off legally and saying, okay, the Dreamers get to stay, and everybody else is going to remain in limbo, and they're going to be a much more vulnerable political target when we're talking about adults who came here voluntarily rather than children who were brought here involuntarily. And that deal couldn't be done because of objections on the left. And I think in this election cycle, All we can say is the truth. Immigrants commit less crime. Immigrants are economically a boon to this country. The low immigrant countries like Japan are really shafting themselves demographically, shafting themselves from a workforce perspective. And do we want to shoot ourselves in the foot just because some people don't want to see signs in Spanish or Chinese in particular neighborhoods? And you know, the problem is that there are people who are willing to be poorer if it means that other people will be poorer still. And they're not going to say, well, you know, the economy as a whole is improved if a bunch of more folks are admitted, if it feels like the government isn't prioritizing them anymore the way that it did in the history that I described. In 1850 or 1870, the government was saying, just because you're white, we're going to give you you can vote and you can have free land, and you're special and wonderful, and this country is for you. And you know, now can't say that anymore. So I think that, in my opinion, is at the root of a lot of the anxiety that exists in some quarters today about immigration. It's not something that's going to be rationally resolved.
Got it. I think, you know, the data on crime and economic benefits of immigrants are really useful things for the messaging question that Tama spoke about. And if you are aware of you know, sources for that information, you know, please send it to me and I will include it in our follow-up email to this group.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, good. And there are other questions, but I know we've kept you longer than you agreed to. So thank you for staying, and thank you for framing what this issue is, why this sort of this historical weight on the issue is something I really hadn't encountered or, you know, thought so much about as being part of the problem that we deal with now. But I think understanding that makes it better, just in terms of understanding why we are where we are, and hopefully eking out a way we can go forward. But thank you so much for the time and for all of the information and for answering all of our questions, and round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.